The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, we remember two Latino activists and the progressive legacy that lives on, plus why the Southern Poverty Law Center is filing a lawsuit over driver's licenses. And Bill Press talks with California Congresswoman Jackie Speier about her new book, Undaunted, Surviving Jonestown, Summoning Courage and Fighting Back. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Latino voters showed up for the midterm elections, nearly doubling their turnout over 2014. And there were many victories to bear witness to the rise in Latino political power. But, as one writer wants us to remember, it's power that comes from the immense dedication of activists who have been working for decades to get us here. Two of them passed away recently, and our first guest helps us remember them. And we say hello to Gustavo Arrelano, feature writer at the LA Times, the author of Orange County, A Personal History, and Ask a Mexican. Gustavo Arrelano, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Gracias for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. Now, in a recent article in the LA Times, you note a record number of Latinos who will now serve in Congress. You write that it's a victory that owes itself in part to activists in the 1980s and 1990s who fought for Latino political power. Two of those activists, unfortunately, died recently. Tell us first, though, if you would, about Antonio Gonzalez, who was the leader of the Southwest Voter Education Project. What was all that work about?
So the Southwest Voter Education Project was actually started by his mentor, Willie Velasquez, this Tejano from San Antonio, who back in the 70s and even the late 60s, while the Chicano movement, the more radical aspect of the movement was going on, he was more down in the ditches, in the political ditches, so to speak, of getting people to get registered, teaching them political literacy. And unfortunately, Willie died way too young in the late 1980s, so Antonio took up that mantle, and literally what Antonio was about was registering, something as simple as registering. From there to mentoring Latinos who want to either get into the political process or run for office themselves. And once these people were in office, really calling them out and mentoring them. But also, I think what's really understated or really not emphasized enough about Antonio is that he connected disparate communities from across the Americas, specifically emphasizing on the Latino, on Latino life, but connecting people with activists in Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, and vice versa, so that everyone can see this is not just a struggle for American citizens, but this is really a borderless struggle where what's happening in Central America will affect the Latinos in the United States sooner than later. So he was a prophet in that sense, but he was also somebody who just, got down and dirty with stuff.
Looking at it globally as opposed to just locally. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we have a president, of course, who's increasingly isolationist. We have a right who really does not want to be involved in the world, which I think is very dangerous and will frankly come back to bite you. So to have people who can think in a global perspective that the struggles of one people in another country really can affect the struggles that are happening, in your neighborhood, and then to have people from those communities talk to you about their experiences and vice versa. In Spanish, it's called the intercambio, an interchange of ideas, an exchange of ideas. That seems to be apparently globalist and evil and Soros-funded nowadays, but really that's how you make a better world and a better country.
You note in your piece that Antonio Gonzalez's philosophy was democracy as trench warfare. And by reading your piece, it's clear he was relentless. Is that how he needs to be remembered?
Oh, absolutely. He was bare knuckles But bare knuckles in the sense that he was going to be opposed to hate, but he's also not someone like he wasn't one of these leaders for an organization that sat behind a desk and commanded from up high. No, he was to the end of his life. He was there on the streets, like literally doing the grunt work, like setting up a tent and setting up a sandwich board for this, for a fair, for a community fair, or like going to high schools and talking to students, maybe an audience of 120. This is a man who really believed in if you're gonna change the political landscape, you have to do it from the very, very bottom. He didn't really care about the top and for himself. He cared about the bottom. It's like from bottoms up, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the intelligent, sensible way to build up anything that you want, right? You start from the bottom and you move up. I wish we had a better understanding of that in this country at the moment.
Exactly.
Let's turn now to someone else that you say was lesser known than Gonzalez, but just as important, Leo Estrada. He was an academic who made an influence far outside the college campus. Tell us about him, if you would.
Leo Estrada joined UCLA in the late 1970s, right when its urban planning department was really starting to evolve and eventually became to what it is today, one of the leading urban planning departments in the United States. So he was there from the beginning. And, you think of academia, you think of course, the cliched ivory tower. And Estrada was from that generation of Chicano activists who thought to themselves, well, it's great and all that we have PhDs. It's great and all that that we're going for tenure. But what good is our work if it's not going to have tangible results to the very people that we say we represent, the Chicanos? So in my column for the LA Times, I recounted something that Estrada remembered. UCLA did a 40th anniversary commemoration of his career this past year. And so Estrada remembered how when he joined UCLA, he goes to his boss and says, hey, is it okay if I'm able to, involve myself in the community through my work? And the head of the department said, like, frankly, that's what academics should do. Just don't get arrested, and we're fine. And to my from what I was able to see, Estrada never got arrested. That said, he was so influential in two very specific ways. The first one I'll talk about is really just in his work on demography. He is recognized as one of the pioneers of studying demography, especially among Latinos, to then be able to translate, again, into those tangible results. So he worked with the federal government to identify, especially the needs of senior citizen Latinos. That was a big thing that then Congress was able to allocate better funds to that. But more importantly, he really cracked down on voting precincts. He really cracked down on registered voters, and he really cracked down on the demographics of those areas to be able to create data that then organizations like the ACLU, like MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, in the 80s and 90s, they started suing entities, whether they be school districts, city councils, board of supervisors across the United States, alleging that at-large voting suppressed the Latino vote, and that and in response they wanted district voting, and they were all armed with Estrada's statistics. And almost all of these various districts across the United States were able to win through the work of Estrada.
Wow. We're speaking with Gustavo Arrelano, featured writer at the LA Times, author of Orange County, A Personal History, and also Ask a Mexican. Gustavo, when we're talking about Leo Estrada, his research helped to build the case to challenge disenfranchisement of Latino voters across the country. Tell us more about that, if you would.
What you have with these lawsuits, so these are lawsuits that go across the United States, and they've been spreading, especially in California. There's lawsuits that are filed saying that the traditional at-large way, in other words, there's three open positions, the top three winners win, and they represent the entire city, that disenfranchises Latinos, and because a lot of times what you have, especially in urban areas, you have a concentration of minorities in one district, but most of the money or most of the richer people or richer voters are in other districts. So you have a lot of, for lack of a better term, white people representing majority minority cities. So the thinking with district elections is that if you split up an area, say a city, into 5 districts, then you're guaranteed that where the Latinos live, that they're most likely going to elect a Latino politician to represent them. And it's borne out in the stats that minority voters tend to vote more likely for minority candidates. So in the 80s, and this was another, this came from another revolutionary Latino who passed away this year, Joaquin Avila. In the 80s, this was unheard of. Even though, you've had district elections across the United States in the big cities for decades, in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and the like. But once you started going down into smaller cities, this idea that, the at-large voting system actually disenfranchises voters. So a lot of these municipalities just did not believe it. That's when you go into the courts, and in the courts, all of the, again, armed with the stats of Leo Estrada, these nonprofits or these activists were able to prove voter disenfranchisement. And you've seen, and the results, of course, is that these municipalities went to district elections, and you have seen a tangible result in more minority representation on school boards, on city councils, going up to eventually all of those people who run at the lower end, they end up becoming the state assemblymen and the congresswomen of today.
And he will also be remembered as a mentor. Tell us why this is important, particularly for a scholar of color.
Oh, my Lord, yeah. So I'm ashamed to say that I knew very little of Leo Estrada until he passed away. And then on Facebook, because I have a lot of Chicano and Latino academics who are friends, they started posting these very personal testimonials about their interaction with Leo. And I talked to one of my former bosses. I used to teach at Cal State Fullerton here in Southern California. So Alejandro Jose Gravia, he's a professor of Chicano Studies at Cal State Fullerton. And even though he never had Estrada, he knew these stories. And he said that Estrada was a type of professor that he never closed his doors to anyone. Whatever you needed, whether you needed a letter of recommendation, just a pep talk, some professional advice, he was always there. Unfortunately, in academia, far too often you do get stuck in the ivory tower, and people do not want to help. And especially with academia, all you want is tenure. All you want to do is publish. You don't want to help out anyone else if that means you're not going to be able to get something out of it. And so Estrada was the opposite of that. And it seems like such a superficial thing, or really such a cliched thing to say, oh, yeah, he helped a lot of people. But in the world of academia, where minorities are still severely underrepresented, to have such a titan of the field, be a Chicano from El Paso that's willing to help out everyone, but especially young academics of color, that cannot be overstated. And of course, that's what you're going to get the least amount of recognition for. But in many ways, that's the most powerful legacy that someone can have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's refreshing to hear it. There are so many lessons to be learned, and I want to say thank you for bringing more attention to these two remarkable men for us. But before we let you go, as Latinos take on new political power, what do they hope they're able to achieve?
Nothing less than just be a true part of the American experience and the American experiment. We still have way too many Latinos who are not getting the education they deserve, who are not getting the jobs that they deserve, who are not getting the opportunities or the equity that they deserve. So to have more Latinos in the political process, hopefully we could address that, whatever that may be. Whether, that's all, the policy that we need is a whole other conversation. But by having people who look like us, in other words, by having minorities in the halls of Congress, in the halls of the state capitol, and on the mayoral seat, that's how you can start changing things slowly but surely. And even something as simple as representation. I cannot overemphasize how important positive representation of a minority group is through the psyches of young, of children. Back then, it's like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The whole idea of the old Jimmy Stewart movie, directed by Frank Capra. If you could have the little guy in Congress, but that little guy is actually a woman and she's a Latina, then that's going to inspire people to want to join in that political process. So that's the hope. I mean, 2018 is a record-breaking year. Let's make sure it's not an anomaly. Let's make sure that it's the new normal.
Yeah, come on 2020, absolutely.
Yeah.
Gustavo Arrelano, feature writer at the LA Times and the author of Orange County, A Personal History and Ask a Mexican, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Gustavo, thank you so much for your time with us. We appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Gracias so much for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, when taking away a driver's license can be a punishment or poverty. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you're wondering where Congress's next truly bad idea will come from, keep an eye on a secretive far right-wing outfit called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a legislative bawdy house with an exclusive corporate clientele. The Koch brothers, AT&T, ExxonMobil, and other giants pay ALEC to hook them up with Republican state lawmakers who are, well, on the make. In exchange for sponsoring the corporation's special interest bills, the legislators gain corporate sugar daddies to fund their future campaigns. It's a hanky-panky quid pro quo that produces litter after litter of bad laws. Consider one that's an absolute corporate wet dream, for it would remove the people's power to elect our United States senators, letting state legislators choose them. This maneuver to take power from the people and turn it over to far higher legislators would return America to the days of outright auctioning of Senate seats. Until the people passed the 17th Amendment in 1913, senators were chosen in backroom deals between corporate bribers and crooked lawmakers, and ALEC's draft proposal is bluntly succinct. The 17th Article of Amendment is hereby repealed. Back to the future. This idea of ripping off the people's democratic power is being touted by such intellectual giants as Rick Oops Perry, the corrupt ex-governor of Texas, who's now turning tricks for oil and nuclear power conglomerates as Trump's energy secretary. Perry wails that the 1913 law letting the public elect senators, quote, took the states out of the process. So now Rick and other corporate supremacists want to take the people out of the electoral process so the state can control it. The corporate state, that is. This is Jim Hightower saying, to repeal this effort, connect with commoncause.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The Southern Poverty Law Center is challenging Alabama's practice of suspending driver's licenses of individuals who fail to pay traffic tickets, arguing it violates the 14th Amendment by punishing persons simply because they are poor. Our next guest explains the connection. And we say hello to Samuel Brook, Deputy Legal Director of the Economic Justice Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Sam Brook, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
My pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
and ours to have you with us. The SPLC recently filed a lawsuit against the Alabama law enforcement agency over driver's licenses that are being revoked due to outstanding debts to the state. How common is this problem?
This is a very common problem across the country. Many states have on their books a rule or a statute or a provision that says that when people don't pay their fines or costs, that their license can be suspended because they didn't comply, because they didn't pay that fee. The problem with this is that the states are not doing any sort of inquiry into why the person didn't pay. So what the result of that is that if a person has money and they're able to pay their fines and costs, no problem. They go about their lives. They get the speeding ticket. They probably just write a check and send it in. They don't even need to go to court. And they're done and clear, and they keep on going about their lives. By contrast, a person living paycheck to paycheck who's struggling to get by gets that speeding ticket, hundreds of dollars, goes to court, pleads guilty, gets found guilty, gets the fine or cost, finds out they have to pay all this money. They're not able to do it. And the next thing they know, they've lost their driver's license simply because they were not able to pay. That's unconscionable. We think a clear violation of law because we're punishing people simply because of their poverty.
I think it may seem obvious to most of us, but what's wrong with this kind of policy?
Yeah, I mean, from both a policy level and from a legal level, from a policy perspective, it just makes no sense. This has nothing to do with safety, right? These individuals are losing their license simply because they didn't pay their fine. There are obviously some traffic offenses that perhaps a suspension is warranted. Many states have a graduated system that on your first DUI or after a few DUIs, whatever the state law is, you'll lose your license. That's not what we're talking about here. That's a rule where a person loses their license based on conduct, and that would happen to the rich person and the poor person, and that's totally fine. But what's happening here is we're punishing the poor person simply because they are poor, and we're still, by taking their license away, we're giving them an impossible choice. They either keep driving and risk getting caught again for breaking the law of driving without a license and then getting more fines and costs, or they stop driving, in which case they have to try to provide for themselves and their family and get to work without having a driver's license. This is incredibly counterintuitive because it actually means it's less likely that a person will ever be able to pay off that fine or cost that they owed that caused the license to be suspended in the first place, because we're pulling out the rug beneath their feet and we're making it harder for them to get by and to earn a living such that they can afford to pay that off in the first place.
Now, this is part of a larger context in that the way fines and court costs, such as cash bail, have an impact on those living in poverty, and it's been compared to a modern-day debtor's prison. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. I mean, what we see over and over again is that when people get assessed fines and costs, and I think there's a distinction between kind of ultimately, the criminal justice system really is a two-tiered system of justice that treats the poor much more harshly than the well-to-do. And I think we see this both on the front end, you referenced bail, and also on the back end with what happens with fines and costs. When we talk about modern-day debtors' prisons, what we mean by that is that individuals are often facing a situation where when they can't pay their fines or costs, they're getting locked up. They're getting locked up simply because they're unable to pay. We've seen this many times, and we've helped many individuals, and we've put a stop to this in different practices. Let me just give one quick story of one of our clients, the first one that we really helped with this situation. She was a grandmother who had gotten a ticket for a speeding ticket, wasn't able to pay it off, then her license was suspended. She got more tickets for driving without a license until she finally stopped driving altogether. She was working part-time. She was walking in the Montgomery summer heat about 5 miles each way to go to a part-time daycare job, walking in the summer heat because she couldn't drive. She wasn't able to come up with the money that was required. And so finally, one Sunday morning, she was at home with her grandchild and she got a knock on the door. She went to the door and there was an officer, and the officer said, I'm here to arrest you. And she said, what for? And he said, because you didn't pay your tickets. And she gets hauled off into jail, goes the next morning in front of a judge, and she goes in front of the judge, and we were in the courtroom watching, and we saw this unfold. She goes in front of the judge, and the judge says, are you able to pay today? And she says, no, I'm not. I don't have the money. And he said, okay, well, then there's nothing we can do. She said, well, wait, I just got a new job. I'd been unemployed for the last couple of months. I just got a new job. If you just give me a little bit more time, I will be able to pay this off. And the judge said, nope, too late. I'm sorry. You're going to jail. And so she was sent off to jail where she was going to sit it out at a rate of $25 a day. So what many jurisdictions will do is they effectively give the person a credit. For every day they spend in jail, they'll get $25 toward their fine. So if you owed $500, $25 a day, that would take you, doing the math in my head, 20 days to be to get free and clear. You'd be spending 20 days in jail just because of your inability to pay. And that is what we saw with her. We were able to intervene, get her out, and get that court to reform its practices. But that is what we refer to as the traditional modern-day debtor's prison, because people are being jailed simply because of their poverty. The driver's license suspension for non-payment is a variation of the same thing. You know, there people aren't being jailed, fortunately, but they're still being punished by losing their license just because they can't pay. And as happened in Ms. Cleveland's case that I was just telling you about, that loss of a license can often result to even further punishments, further punitive action later on down the road.
And if you can't drive, you may not be able to work. You know, if your workplace is 20 miles away and you don't have the money to afford transportation and that kind of thing too, it's unconscionable. We're speaking with Sam Brook, Deputy Legal Director at the Economic Justice Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Sam, what are some more reasonable ways to deal with debts due to the state?
Yeah, there are all sorts of ways that this can be handled in an appropriate manner. Definitely, our view is that individuals need to follow the law, and if they violate the law, there should be an appropriate and proportionate punishment. It just shouldn't be one that treats the poor disproportionately worse than the wealthy and the well-to-do. So, you know, there are various ways that this can be done. The most common way is a version of a payment plan that allows people more time to pay it off. And thus they are still able to pay off what they owe, but they're not required to pay it in a lump sum, and thus they're not punished just because they can't come up with all the money at one time. Louisiana passed a law a couple of years ago. It has not gone into effect, and that's frustrating, but they passed a law and then they extended it, but that would require that individuals not be required to pay any more than 1 day's worth of their wages out of a given month. So effectively, you take a month's worth of wages, you divide it by 30, and that would be the maximum amount that person would be required to pay. It's a very rough estimate of saying, okay, that's a reasonable amount to tax onto somebody that will take into consideration what they can actually afford. And the idea is that then, you know, it would be proportionate to what someone could afford to pay. And if they're able to make good on that and they're able to keep up with it, then at some point you would just say, enough is enough. You've been doing good and keeping up with this. We'll now cut this off and call it even, and you're on your way. Other jurisdictions have done something similar. A lot of jurisdictions will do something like community service. That's a good option in some instances. It can be challenging because you need to make sure that there's actually enough community service or work opportunities for people to perform. You need to make sure that they are appropriate as well, that if someone has a disability, they're still able to complete that work requirement. So community service can be tricky, but it's certainly an option that is worth considering, and some jurisdictions have made it work so long as they really take into account what the person in front of them can actually do. Another thing that some places have done has been really creative in saying, look, if you show me that you're making progress in something else to kind of improve your lives, we'll take that into account. So you complete a GED program. That might be something that a court would say, you know, I'm impressed that you've done these other things to make good on what you did here. You broke the law, you violated the public trust, but now you're doing something to improve yourself so you can contribute more back to the community. I'm going to consider that good enough that I'm going to waive your fines and costs, and you're good to go. All of these are differential ways that we can make sure that our laws are honored and that people are facing some punishment for violating them, but it's not a punishment that is disproportionately punishing people just because they're poor.
Absolutely. Another issue your organization addresses, civil forfeiture. How does this practice affect poor people?
Well, this is a really problematic practice that is especially targeting the poor, but it can catch middle income and even well-to-do people as well. The basic idea of civil asset forfeiture is that when police suspect a person of a crime, they might seize the property that was related to that or property that they think was related to that. And that sounds, if the person's convicted of a crime, that makes sense. That's what we would expect to happen. If someone is accused of breaking the law and they profited from it and got money from it, they would need to forfeit that money. But what often happens is that they will do this civilly. They will just seize the money and never convict anyone. So we had an individual who had a few $1,000s in his house. The police came to the house. They suspected that there was drug activity, they claim. They never proved that. They never tried to prove that. They never tried to get a conviction against him. They instead came into the house, found the money, seized it, claimed that it was for this purpose, and then just took it. And that was the end of the case. The reason that this is particularly pernicious for poor people is that when law enforcement does this, which they have the absolute authority to do in most states, a person has to themselves come forward and challenge that in court. To get the money back, they have to file their own lawsuit in court to get a declaration that what the police did to them was wrong. Now, if you're a person of means who can afford to hire a lawyer, maybe you can do that, and you'll probably, there's a good chance you'll be successful. But if you are working day in and day out just trying to get by, if you don't have the money and resources to cobble together to pay for an attorney, or if, the margins are slim, you're going to pay an attorney $1,000 in an effort to get $3,000 back, it may not be worth it. And so for all of these reasons, we see this process over and over again disproportionately affecting the poor, both for those reasons because they have the hardest time of having any recourse, and also because, let's be realistic, law enforcement is disproportionately targeting individuals who are low income. That is an invariable, an absolute outcome of the way that we focus our policing efforts, that it's much more likely that they're going to be interceding in the lives of the low-income individuals than in those who are well-to-do. So for all of these reasons, we see this as an abhorrent practice that really is allowing law enforcement to punish individuals for no reason whatsoever. And of course, the incentive for the law enforcement is that when they seize this money, they keep it. It goes directly into that law enforcement budget. Sometimes it has to be shared with other jurisdictions, but the more that the police take, the more that they get. This was an outgrowth originally of the so-called war on drugs. The original reason that we started to see these laws was that law enforcement claimed it needed another tool to go after the kingpins, and so they wanted to have a way that even if they couldn't get a conviction, they could still seize the fruits of the drug trade, so that wouldn't go to the individual that they claimed was accused. I think there are lots of reasons that we should think very skeptically about the so-called war on drugs and whether that has any beneficial effect, or if in fact it just has caused more havoc in our society. But clearly this is one of the outgrowths that has gone far beyond just the war on drugs. It's now used in all sorts of different contexts by federal officials, by state officials, by local police and municipalities. And where we see police who unfortunately are not being properly funded by the state or by the local municipality, it creates an abhorrent incentive for them to seize what they can, grab what they can, hope and trust that the individual won't be able to find a lawyer to get it back. And worst case scenario, if they do, they'll just return it. But otherwise, they have just stolen and pilfered what they could and taken it for their own purposes.
So much wrong with it on so many different levels. Sam Brook, Deputy Legal Director of the Economic Justice Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Thank you for your time with us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. We wish you continued success and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it as well.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with California Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who explains why she still believes that politics is the noblest profession.
Join me in welcoming our good friend back to the studio from California's 14th Congressional District, Congresswoman Jackie Speier, also author of her new memoir, a very powerful story called Undaunted. Congratulations, Congressman.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Great to be with you.
Let me ask you first, I want to get into a little bit of your political history, which I know, but not everybody knows. But yesterday, the House and the Senate finally got their act together on something you have been working on for a long time, this whole issue of sexual harassment.
So that picture on the cover of the book was me testifying before the House Administration Committee on the bill last year.
Whoa,
so
yeah.
That's when I told them there were seated members of Congress that had sexual harassment settlements, and we had got to put a stop to the fact that they were not transparent and that the taxpayers were picking up the tab.
And you see this, with in the media, in Hollywood, in the business community, steps have been taken, but Congress is really
so slow,
dragging its heels.
But
yeah.
We have a deal. It should be voted on in the Senate this morning and hopefully in the House this morning as well under unanimous consent.
Whoa.
And we get rid of the process in which a victim was first told to wait a month, then had to go through a month of mandatory mediation, then a cooling off period of a month, and then was subject to signing non-disclosure agreements so she could not ever talk about it. And then the taxpayers picked up the tab. That's not going to be the case anymore. If you have a complaint, you can file it. You will be represented by legal counsel paid for by the House of Representatives.
Wow. Yeah.
And you don't have to go through mediation, non-disclosure agreements only if you want it. And it's also going to apply to interns and fellows who had no protection whatsoever under the existing law.
Great step forward. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
I had to get your take on another item in the news, is that yesterday Leader Pelosi reached a final deal with those still outliers who were not willing to endorse her to return as Speaker. What do you think of this deal? And what do you think of, should Nancy be the next Speaker?
Oh, absolutely. She should be the next Speaker. If you deliver 40 new seats and the majority and contribute more than $250 million to the candidacies of people who are even saying they're going to not support you, I mean, you're a rock star, right? As she put it yesterday in a meeting. Yeah, well, I sit in the back of the plane eating peanuts for dinner, going around the country raising money, and I'm not worthy. She didn't quite put it that way,
right.
But it was that visual that kind of sticks in my mind.
But the deal, as I understand it, is that leaders of the House from now on can serve no more than 3 terms unless they get a 2/3 vote of the caucus.
Well, that is the proposal that will be debated by the caucus in the following 2 to 3 months. And I feel that it's probably unlikely to pass.
Really?
Well, I don't think you can. I don't think you can make that kind of a determination
in the future going forward.
Yeah. And for Nancy Pelosi, she says this isn't changing my plans one way or the other.
Right.
So they can have a win, but it's not changing my plans. And 4 years is a long, long time in politics.
Yeah.
Lots of things could change.
Don't we know? What did you? What was your read on her performance in the Oval Office meeting?
Brilliant. I've watched Nancy now for 10 years, even more, but 10 years since I've been in Congress, and she always plays the proper role. She's always very respectful. She kind of broke out of her shell a little bit, and boy, it was a great example of you take on a woman with strength and power. Watch out. So I said to her, I'm just so relishing the interactions between this president who is so misogynistic, cannot stand strong women, have to deal with Nancy Pelosi over the next 2 to 4 years.
I mean, he started out with that little taunt about, we know that you're so weak, Nancy, because you can't really speak today. And she just shot right back and said, don't you dare question my authority to be, right?
And the 40 members
the
that
40
I
members. Yeah.
just elected, and the fact that you don't have a majority in the House anymore. Yeah.
And plus, Donald Trump walked right into the trap she said about the Trump showdown. She laid that out there, branding it as the Trump showdown, which he bought. Right?
Yeah, he does. He's so out of his element, and he's not accustomed to being anything but a bully. And you can't be a bully as president when you don't have control of all the branches of government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yesterday, the president's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, sentenced to 3 years for crimes committed under the direction of Donald Trump. Peter was just telling me that Donald Trump now is going nutso on Twitter this morning. Peter, about Michael Cohen.
Yeah, lots of tweets from Donald Trump here in the last couple of minutes. Let's just read from his Twitter feed. He says, quote, I never directed Michael Cohen to break the law. He was a lawyer and he is supposed to know the law. It is called, quote, advice of counsel, end quote. And a lawyer has great liability if a mistake is made. That is why they get paid. Despite that, many campaign finance lawyers have strongly stated that I did nothing wrong with respect to campaign finance laws, if they even apply, because this was not campaign finance. Cohen was guilty on many charges unrelated to me, but he pled to 2 campaign charges which were not criminal, and of which he probably was not guilty even on a civil basis. Those charges were just agreed to by him in order to embarrass the president, get a much reduced prison sentence, which he did, including the fact that his family was temporarily let off the hook. As a lawyer, Michael has great liability to me. Now, first of all, the president did not write that. All right, that is way too clear and to the point.
There's no spelling errors.
There's no spelling errors. There's no weird capitalizations. The president did not write that. That is from somebody internally.
But it also sounds, doesn't Congresswoman, like he's a little worried about?
Well, he should be.
The implications?
The walls are closing in on him. And he is, in many respects, acting like a wounded animal. And, we need to realize that what that was a very intricate fraud perpetrated on the American people and on the election process for president. They created an LLC out of Delaware. They put money, he put money into it, Cohen did. He then paid off Stormy Daniels. There was then a repayment of him in the form of a loan with, I guess, interest. It was done very specifically to prevent her from speaking during the campaign. Now, all you have to do is look at the pattern with the National Enquirer, where they said that they paid off Karen McDougal because they did not want her to speak and impact the election of Donald Trump. This man has a long reputation of violating the law and, for the most part, getting away with it.
Right. And in both cases, with Michael Cohen and the National Enquirer, they both said that what they did was done at the direction of, following the orders of Donald Trump, who, in effect, is now an unindicted co-conspirator. Right.
Well, he is a co-conspirator. There's no question about it. And maybe he will be indicted.
Yeah.
There's a real question. It's a Department of Justice policy not to indict a sitting president. But think about it. If, in fact, he shot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue, would we allow him to continue as the president of the United States?
One would hope not. Yeah, right.
Or would we, or would he be indicted by the local U.S. attorney or district attorney or whomever? So I think that policy was one that was crafted to just, keep the country from shredding into threads because of what would happen. I mean, it would create, I think, a great turmoil. No question about it.
Right.
We saw that with Clinton's impeachment. It was not a pretty sight.
So what level of priority does impeachment have in the new Congress, from your perspective?
I think it all depends on the final report by the special counsel. I mean, he has so much more information than we do. And he, kind of puts it out there in one indictment after another. And I think we have to wait till it's all assembled. But right now, we do know that the president's attorney, his campaign manager, his national security advisor, his assistant campaign manager, all have either been convicted or pled guilty. What does that tell you?
Yeah.
His orbit is filled with people that have committed crimes.
Yeah, we pointed out this morning earlier, Michael Cohen is the fourth one to face a prison term. Paul Manafort will too, but so far 4. And the 7th to plead guilty. Mm-hmm. All people in Donald Trump's immediate campaign orbit.
Once there is a link, if there is a link that can be made between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks or Russia, then you have a done deal.
Right. And related to that impeachment question is, because I get this question asked all the time. Okay, Democrats happy day. We've got 40 seats. Democrats get control back of the House of Representatives, which is huge and so important. So what are Democrats going to do with that power? Is it going to be just a whole mess of hearings, investigations? Is there going to be any legislative agenda? What do you see?
Oh, well, we're going to be a check on the executive power that's being used at a level that we've never seen before. And we are going to deliver to the American people.
I might point out that's your job.
That is my job, right.
Right, yeah. Under the Constitution, the House allocates the money and then has a responsibility to make sure the money is being properly spent by every agency, every department, including the White House.
That's right.
Right.
So, but we have also made a commitment to the American people. We're going to secure the Affordable Care Act. We're going to deal with the cost of prescription drugs and bring the costs down. We're going to do a transportation infrastructure measure, and we're going to scrub Washington of the corruption that we've seen in this administration. Nepotism that's been going on, the people that have been hired as secretaries of the various cabinet posts that, frankly, are the wolves watching the hen house, and the kinds of conduct that we've seen in this administration that needs to stop.
And the very first agenda item, I guess, H.R. 1, which is already in, about a whole variety of campaign finance.
Tax returns. Every candidate for a president is going to have to file their
and
tax returns.
And voting rights and all of it lumped together in this H.R. 1, which is, again, Speaker-to-be Pelosi has talked about. So it's going to be, there'll be a lot of hearings. There's also going to be an active political legislative agenda. Any of that get through the Senate, do you foresee?
Well, it'll be a real test of the Senate. And I think what you're going to start to see is if his power is eroding, which I think it is, even in his base, you're going to see the Republicans in the Senate start to have a bit of a backbone and show some independence. I mean, they have a little bit on the Khashoggi incident
and on the war on Yemen.
And the war on Yemen. So I think that you're going to see more of that.
You must be particularly excited about the young women who are moving into the House. I mean, said it before, the House of Representatives is just never going to be the same.
No, that's right. So we're going from 19% to almost 24%. We're going. There were 36 women elected to Congress this time. 35 of them from the Democratic side of the aisle, only one Republican.
That speaks volumes, doesn't it?
And the other thing is the number of Republican women serving in the House went from 23 to 13.
Republicans, right.
But
just the opposite. While the Democrats soared with new young women, particularly women of color, the Republican numbers
dropped.
And
the other thing that's really interesting about this class is 22 of those 35 women on the Democratic side, 22 of them have never run for public office before. I mean, that to me is just a stunning figure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Women got up one morning and said, I'm not going to take this. I'm going to run for Congress. And they beat very senior Republicans in the House.
And most of them did it without any PAC money.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, more and more just saying, I'm not going to take any PAC money.
And it just goes to show you, American people will give $5 here, $10 there to keep a clean election process.
Right. No, they're very exciting stories. And I think the potential that they've already made a difference, I think, in the whole tone that they bring to it and everything, right? They're going to have a real impact. I don't see, you've met all of them. I haven't yet. But I don't see this class as a class that's going to just sit there and be quiet for a couple of years.
Oh, no. I mean, unfortunately, they will be impacted by a lot of the rules that do exist. But, and I remember coming here
limits,
thinking,
yeah,
this place is really run like this. But you do learn that there is a system. But they're going to make noise and they're going to take action. And I think we're going to see some great things coming out of them. I'm actually looking forward to seeing them in action.
Oh, I'm sure. It's very, very exciting. And you have your own story about getting involved in politics, which you tell in your new book, Undaunted. I love the title. How did you get started in politics?
I worked on my very first political campaign at the age of 16. And it was just, my parents had gotten a solicitation in the mail. I filled it out and said I didn't have any money, but I'd like to volunteer on the campaign. It was then a State Assemblyman Leo Ryan's campaign. And that's how it all started. Mm-hmm. And then he became obviously my mentor, and then he was assassinated in Jonestown, and I was
He moved
shot.
on to the State Assembly.
He was in the State Assembly. So then I got accepted to college at UC Davis, not Stanford, and I was devastated. But it was the best thing that happened to me because I was 20 minutes from the state capitol, and then
Did you work in his office in Sacramento?
I did.
Yeah. Right.
And so I had that experience, and then he went on to Congress, and I came back here for a couple of years, and then went home to go to law school, and then eventually came back here again.
Came back here again in his office in Washington.
Right.
And you start the book by talking about you thought you were dying. I mean, you thought you were done lying on the tarmac.
28 years old.
How?
I was 28 years old. And
so this was a not a congressional delegation, but his trip. Tell us why this trip.
So he made the trip to Guyana in South America, to a commune there called Jonestown. It was led by the Reverend Jim Jones. He had a church in San Francisco. Many of Congressman Ryan's constituents, young adult constituents, had gotten involved in his church. Their parents concerned about their well-being and whether or not there was mind control going on down there. Number of defectors had come out. He interviewed them. Was told that there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, that there was Social Security checks are being signed over to him. There was gun running down there. So he went down to investigate that.
There were lots of bad stories coming out of Jonestown.
And one of the messages of that whole experience was we had a lot of people in power in San Francisco at the time, the mayor and law enforcement officers that looked the other way because he had a ready group of 2,000 members of his congregation that could go out and walk precincts or create a huge rally for you, a huge crowd at the moment's notice. He ingratiated himself, got to be chair of the housing.
All the politicians used to go to that church, and
Right.
he had a lot of power in San Francisco.
So they looked the other way. The State Department did not do its due diligence, did not, had a duty to investigate, a duty to warn, a duty to protect, failed on all three counts there, and 900 Americans lost their lives down there.
Whoa. And so when Congressman Ryan, you went down on that delegation and visited there?
And we took a number of people out with us. We were on the airstrip. We didn't know this at the time, obviously. There was a tractor trailer following behind us from at some distance. They jumped off the tractor trailer, started shooting. The congressman was shot 45 times. Three of the members of the press were killed. I was shot 5 times and left for dead on that airstrip for 22 hours. And that's how the book starts.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it was a very powerful story. Well, how did you get out of there?
So I was there for 22 hours. Finally, they...
did the Guyana police come in and...
Well, the Guyanese army secured the airstrip around 5 a.m. the next morning. This was like 5 p.m. the night before. And then eventually there was a cargo plane that landed and airlifted us out of there. We then went to Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, where there was a U.S. medevac plane waiting. And there's this huge white plane and the words United States of America written across it. And it was like someone had just wrapped me in the American flag.
I'm sure, yeah.
And I go to that moment in time every time I say the Pledge of Allegiance or sing the national anthem because it reminds me of how lucky I am to be
in a
here.
sense, it's you could have gone the other way and just said, the hell with politics, right, after this.
Right. So I just, I just made a
you-
commitment to myself that if I survived, I'd never take another day for granted. I'd live every day as fully as I possibly could, and that I would dedicate my life to public service. So that's what I've done. And there have been lots of ups and downs. I mean, I've lost 3 times in elections. 14 years later, my husband was killed in an automobile accident when I was pregnant with our second child. And I was 3 months from personal bankruptcy. So there's a lot of trauma in this book, but it's also about hardship and healing and taking tragedy and turning it into triumph.
Oh, what a survivor. Again, the book is Undaunted by Jackie Speier, member of the United States Congress, and her story, which is an incredible story. And so, but you still, Congress, I know you pretty well, you still are a believer. You still believe in the process, and you're still dedicated to public service and plan to continue that, right? I mean, that's your life.
I was raised during the Kennedy era, as were you, and that was Camelot, and that was the highest calling, was to serve in government. And I still believe it. I still believe the process works. Sometimes it takes longer than it should, as the sexual harassment bill has taken. But it works, and you just have to have faith in the process and work the process.
Where Kennedy said politics is a noblest profession, quoting somebody, I forget, but I've often quoted that myself. I mean, you're right. With all the ups and downs, it's still the way, I believe, to bring about change, right?
And
you got to stay in the trenches and just keep at it. I mean, like, I'm sure you've talked to a lot of these freshman members of Congress who are coming in, right? Mm-hmm. And those who do believe they don't know it all yet, they can still learn from people like you. I mean, what do you tell them?
Well, I don't tell them anything.
Oh, okay. It's the wrong word. Yeah.
I offer them advice if they ask, and they're also pretty awed by the fact that they're now members of Congress, and they want to do the right thing. They were drawn to it for all the right reasons, and I think that's what's going to continue to keep our country on the right track.
You certainly can show them. It doesn't happen overnight, but if you stick to it and keep at it, you can make a big difference, as you have. Again, congratulations on the book. It's Undaunted, Congresswoman Jackie Speier. Great to see you, Congresswoman. Happy holidays. I'd hope you don't spend them here in the United States Congress in the middle of a showdown.
Well, you know where I'm going?
Shutdown. Yes.
I'm going to the border to see our troops, and then I'm going to Tijuana.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Gustavo Arrelano, Samuel Brook, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.